about some of their experiences, and then we're going to bring it back to Pam for some reflections and close. So that is our roadmap. And I so appreciate all of you being here, especially at the end of the quarter. For some of you, this may be your very last day of law school, which is amazing. So anyway, we're really excited to host you. Okay, so Pam Samuelson is visiting us from Berkeley for a few days. She is the Richard M. Sherman Distinguished Professor of Law and a professor of at the School of Information at UC Berkeley. She co-directs the famous Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. She is, among other things, a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, absolutely a leading person in law and technology, and we're really happy you could spend this time with us, Pam. So thank you very much. And then next up on our faculty, Mary Fan. She is the McDonald Endowed Chair at the School of Law. She's an affiliate faculty with the Center for an Informed Public, which is an interdisciplinary center here on campus. She's an expert in, among other things, criminal law and immigration, and on data as a public service. And maybe you may not know this, but Professor Fan has also pursued advanced training and collaboration in epidemiology, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to her about that experience. Next up, we have Sadia Pekkanen. Sadia is a professor in the Jackson School of International Studies and an adjunct professor here at the School of Law. We're lucky for her to be teaching space law and policy to our students for the first time this year. She's a member of a task force that I'm the chair of on technology and society across the entire campus that's happening this year. And she's the founder and director of the QUAL program, dedicated to introducing qualitative and quantitative studies to various areas of that need it, and also the co-founder and co-director of SPARC, which is the Space Policy and Research Center, which has had some amazing programming in the last few years with the School of Aeronautical, with a professor in aeronautical engineering. And then last but not least, Yoshi Kono. He's a professor in the Computer Science and Engineering School, the Allen School. He's also an adjunct professor here at the School of Law, or affiliate professor here. He is the founder and co-director of the Privacy and Security Lab, as well as of the Tech Policy Lab, which I just mentioned. And he is an excellent burgeoning science fiction author, and I could not recommend enough some of his recent works, like Our Reality, his novella, and many short stories. So very interesting. All right, so with that, I am going to turn next to ask Pam a couple of questions. So Pam, you are a person in the field who is associated with being among the first and deepest bridges between law and, in particular, computer science. And the first question I have for you is a bit about your experiences as, I believe, the first legal commentator to be asked to do a column for ACM. And I wanted to ask you what that experience has been like a bit, and I'll return to some of the other things too, but that was an opening question I had for you.
So actually, I wasn't the first person to have been a legal commentator for Communications of the ACM, which is a computing journal that all 100,000 members of ACM worldwide subscribe to and get on a monthly basis. But there was one guy who did a column, and because my husband is a computer scientist, I was looking at the CACM columns and the like. And what I saw was this guy was basically using the column to try to solicit business, right? And so here's kind of like, here's a really complicated legal problem. It's really too difficult for you guys to understand, but I'd be glad to talk. I mean, it wasn't said quite that blatantly, but it was like clearly the message of that particular thing. And I had been going to a lot of computing conferences because my husband was giving talks and the like at them. And I happened to talk to Diane Crawford, who was the editor of the CACM, and said, you know, you really should get somebody who's going to like try to talk in a straightforward way about what's going on. What are the lawyers talking about? what are the terms of discourse that they use in explaining why this lawsuit has happened. So in a case like Lotus v. Borland, which for many of you is like ancient history, if you know anything about it at all, it was a really live issue at the time about whether the command hierarchy of Lotus 123 was protectable by copyright law or not. Well, people in the computing field had no idea what that meant. And so I ended up writing not only a series of amicus curiae briefs to various courts to try to explain what I thought copyright law should be understood to mean, but I also started translating what the lawyers were talking about into terms which computers and scientists could really understand, like what's at stake in your field. And one of my kind of coolest experiences was I just happened, after having just married my husband, to be at a reception for a computing conference that was being held in Washington, D.C. And I was talking about the Lotus v. Borland case and the Apple v. Microsoft case, which was happening out in the West Coast and not on the East Coast as the Lotus cases were. And the guy who was running the conference for the next year said, why don't you come and be a keynote at the next conference and invite lawyers who are arguing on this, the lawyers who are litigating this case, why don't you invite them to talk, because people in the computing field should hear from people like that. And so we ended up doing that. But on the way to the place where this was being held, my husband and I decided to try to put together a survey about what people in the computing field thought about the look and feel lawsuits. And we figured that after the people who were attending the conferences, this was a plenary session, 1,000 people were in the audience. You hand out a survey after they'd been listening to, the guy was representing Apple in the Microsoft case and one of the lawyers in the Lotus case, and they heard exactly the same kind of like amount of time and so forth. And we figured, why don't we find out what they think? And so we ended up doing a survey. 770 people filled out the survey. And we were able to report back both to the CACM, because I put it in one of my columns, that overwhelmingly the people in the computing field, these were user interface designers, right? These were the people who were going to be affected by this lawsuit. Overwhelmingly said no to look and feel lawsuits, terrible idea. And they thought copyright protection should be available for program code. Yeah, they're up for that, but this look and feel thing, they were completely against it. And to be able to report back to the field, what are you guys thinking? And then I published the same with a little bit of additional material in a legal journal, so that people in the legal field could know about what people in the technical field thought about these cases. And I think it may have just nudged the things a little bit in a particular direction. Ultimately, the First Circuit and the Ninth Circuit in the two cases, prominent look and feel cases, both of them rejected the high protections arguments that Apple and Lotus had been making. And so I felt like that was, that was one of the places where, some understanding about what it was that they were talking about and how would it affect people in the field, that seemed to me to be something worth reporting.
Pam, that is fascinating. I will say that as a person who, a lot of my research involves putting together interdisciplinary teams, and they may span 2-3 different disciplines, right? And of course, being a law professor and having JD students, we're often among those teams. And one of the things that it strikes me that lawyers can do on these teams is be effective translators. Because that's one of the things that we train everybody to do, right? Just like understand a context well enough to be able to talk about it persuasively. And so you're playing that translation role at scale is fascinating. One follow-up question, and then I'm going to turn to our other panelists for a bit. This is about talking across disciplines. It's about getting communities to see what they feel and understand what we're talking about. But you're also associated with practice, because your name is on multiple early cyber law or law and technology policy clinics, famously the Samuelson Clinic at Berkeley, and then many, many emulators. Though we don't bear your name, I think that the Tech Law and Policy Clinic here, directed by Bill Covington, owes, and I'm sure Bill would agree, owes a great debt to those predecessors as well. So how did you come to decide that it was important to foster and invest in the clinical model of looking at cyber law and law and policy?
So I had students, I was teaching a cyber law class at the law school, practicing at the information school. And my students keep coming up to me and saying, gosh, there's this new bill that was introduced. I wish there was something we could do about it. Or this new lawsuit just got filed. I wish there was something we could do about it. So I asked for my students, do they want to volunteer to work with me about the idea of putting together a proposal for a technology law clinic. The sense that I had at the time was that big tech was talking about stuff and other big companies were talking about stuff, but there wasn't really anybody to represent some of the public interests that were at stake in some of the tech policy issues. So my students, basically 5 of the students, each wrote up 2 kind of examples of what kinds of things the technology clinic could do. Who would they represent? What was the issue? What was the need for representation? Whose voice wasn't getting heard? And what kind of way could a tech clinic actually make things happen that would be positive contribution? And so we put together this proposal and I shared it with the guy who was then the head of the clinical programs at Berkeley. And he said, I said, we want to do this thing about public interest in technology law. And he said, public interest, there's no public interest in technology law. And I said, that you think that is exactly why we need it. And so the next thing I know, one of my students, Jason Schultz, who's now the clinic director at NYU Law School, and I presented the proposal to the faculty approved it, and then we were lucky enough to get 2 foundation grants to get it started, and then that's history. But we're really proud that the technology policy and technology law clinical thing has really taken off. It's really been a great way for students to get more in-depth training in technology law, but also to really understand that just because I want this to be an outcome, it doesn't mean that it's in the public interest. So learning to talk about sort of what is the public interest and how do I articulate those interests and represent them appropriately is something that I think has been a real important contribution. And so the clinic at Berkeley, and I'm pretty sure the policy lab here, doesn't want to just, kind of write a trademark application for somebody, or to kind of, write up a patent or something like that. That's all well and good, and some of the tech clinics do that. But we wanted to do things that would have a broader impact, where if we filed a brief in support of some entity and we were able to say, here are some reasons why this case should come out this way, then we should be able to have a bigger impact. So I'm going to be talking later today about copyright and consumer protection. And one of our students represented and was able to argue to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in a case involving copyright and garage door openers. And the clinic at Berkeley wrote an amicus curiae brief in support of the defendant in this particular case, and on behalf of Consumers Union, right? So the case involved the kind of technically protected garage door opener, and the company that made the original one wanted to stop a competitor from selling garage door openers in competition. And the clinic student was able to stand up and make an argument. And it was, you know, at the 10th anniversary, he said that was the proudest moment of my legal career.
That's really, I mean, I will say that on that note, as a person who knows the tech law and policy space very, very well, many of the leading lights in that area today come through either your clinic or clinics that are roughly based upon it. Here at the University of Washington, that's also true. I can name a lot of folks who've come through there, but we have a tech policy lab that puts people in interdisciplinary teams. And then we have a tech law and policy clinic that uses a model closer to what you're saying, which is where there's actual clients and our students get into teams to service those clients. All right, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, and move over to my colleague, our colleague, Mary Fan. And Mary, you know, similarly to what I asked Pam, I mean, you decided at some point in your career that you were not just you're like not content to be an all-star crim and immigration scholar known all over the country and a privacy scholar, but you decided that you're going to need to know a little bit more about something called epidemiology, which, by the way, everybody now has a PhD in epidemiology at Twitter. But at the time, this was years ago, nobody knew anything about epidemiology, right? And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, what led you to reach out across campus, not just in terms of educating yourself, but also you do these deep collaborations with our colleagues at Harvard. So could you speak to that, please?
Sure, but I'm going to commit a cardinal sin of appellate argument and not answer the question that's been posed.
All right.
And the reason why is because what Pam said was so powerful. And I know the students in this room, you're here despite the fact that you have my final and other finals and mid-quarter quizzes coming up very shortly. And you're here because you're passionate, and you may one day be like the students that Professor Samuelson talked about. Like, that's your hope. I know a couple of you are actually trying to find trying to connect with some of the folks here, like, and would love to connect with like Professor Covington and Professor Kalo to offer your talents and vision for a tech policy lab, and now you have them. So come on up afterwards. You've been telling me as one else, because I think you have a lot of great ideas and expertise. So I thought that was really inspiring. So the cool things that you can do in collaboration with faculty members in this space. I work in, so with respect to epidemiology, enough about that, about me. I don't like talking about myself very much, clearly. So with respect to epidemiology, for those of you who have ever taken a criminal law or procedure class, I often tell my students that by the time things have gotten to the criminal justice system, everybody's hurt, things have gone bad. You can't fix things all the way back to normal. You can try to restore as best you can, but really the search for solutions happens way farther upstream. And so that's where my interest in epidemiology comes in. So I'm interested, so epidemiology, people usually think about things like, I know in the olden days, the hot zone or infectious disease, but actually violence and other injuries, other harms also can be modeled in a way like an infectious disease. And so that's where my interest comes from, is identifying risk factors and prevention before the harm starts. So that's where I come from with respect to epidemiology. And I've been really inspired by my colleagues in the schools of medicine and public health. I mean, I have been inspired by having teachers whose grants fund whole hospitals. You know, they have whole ecosystems of folks who depend on them. And I mean, we have amazing rock stars, like Professor Kalo is such a rock star. That's why he can bring like the leading lights in the field here. So we are very lucky to have some of the nation's leading scholars in this space, some of the most exciting, most cited scholars, and that's awesome in the law school. But if you look at the wider campus, and you can also take classes outside of our law school too, you know, we have some of the world and certainly the nation's top scholars. We have them here on this panel as well from other schools, but we also have them all across campus, and certainly in epidemiology and the schools of public health. And so I just honestly found it inspiring to sit and listen to these folks whose work is, they're literally saving people's lives, and there's, I can't believe all they do. They're so inspiring. And I come to my colleagues and I say, you guys, I think this is not worth getting that upset about. There are people who are doing a lot, with their work. So I think it's good to get a kind of perspective check to do interdisciplinary work and just frankly see something from a different culture and a different ecosystem of work. It makes you kind of widen your vision. It certainly helped me identify issues like lack of access to data to be able to conduct research that might be life-saving or that might improve people's lives. And so that's, in fact, one of my most recent articles was inspired by the attempt to get data that's been locked away, and therefore we can't do research. And we do a lot of scavenging. Epidemiology is called, as we call ourselves, like data scavengers. We often are trying to find pieces of data to be able to even do rigorous research. And so it's been really inspiring to work with colleagues at Harborview who specialize in violence prevention, which doesn't get as much funding. So they're really, they're pretty amazing because they kind of scrabble for funding and still make things happen despite everything.
That's wonderful. It is so inspiring. I mean, I'll tell you the thing about University of Washington, like Berkeley, is it's a world-class research university. You know what I mean? It's one of the largest research universities in the world. I like to joke that we do 3 Harvards worth of research a year here, right? And when you look across campus, you see people not only with different methodologies and so on, but also different models for how to be a professor and what to do. One of the things you may not know is that it's very commonplace for professors in other departments to raise funding. And that funding can be used for students and can be used for their own salaries and that kind of thing. And some of us at this law school have been trying to explore and onboard that model. And as a consequence, my own salary, 50% of it, 50% of it, is paid by external grants. So in other words, not you, right? Not your tuition dollars. Mm-hmm. And that's a lovely thing. I think we should be doing more of. And Mary's another person who is part of this small group of people doing this kind of work. And so it opens our eyes to different norms, different approaches, different methods, and different ideas. So thank you so much. Sadia, I'm going to turn to you next. I have been so impressed with your, you've been one of these people who has just said to herself, I'm just going to forge these connections if they don't exist. And I'm going to reach out to the people on campus doing the work I'm interested in. And I'm going to build the institutions that seem to matter. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the foundation of Spark and what sparked, sorry for the pun, your interest in space law and how you put that together. If you could speak about that for a bit. I know you have to leave early, but go or on time, but yeah.
Of course. Thank you, first of all, Ryan, for having us here. I think I am so pleased to be on this panel, which is really about interdisciplinarity in a way that is not just drawing attention to what we're doing, but that is also potentially sustainable. It's easy to start things, it's hard to sustain them. But what I would say at the University of Washington is that we are so extraordinarily lucky, because when you reach out to a colleague from a totally different department or totally different culture, they respond and they want to build institutions. And I think that is what makes us really a world-class place where you want to stay and do research and build things. So I have been extremely fortunate. My own training is in political science and law. And when people ask me, why do you want to do space? I was like, why do you want to do anything in life? Because sometimes it's just one of those things that I was always very passionate about. And what we're beginning to find out here at the University of Washington is that I'm not the only one. For a long time, for really close to 20, 30 years, people weren't talking about space, but now they are in a big way. So I always say to students, please make sure that you do something that you love and are passionate about, because you never know when something might become important. I was also very impressed to hear about the way that you were translating between lawyers and policy analysts and engineers. And this is, I think, where we are in the space domain today as well, is that in a field that is very much dominated by lawyers and policy analysts, we have to build bridges with the engineers and the data scientists. And that's really sort of what is pushing our interest in making sure that space law and policy goes across these units. So the class that I teach, and I see some of my students here, this is a class on space law and policy that Ryan mentioned. And this is a very concrete example of how you put something in place that can actually draw in students from very different departments. So this class gets students from international studies. It gets students, and it's listed in aeronautics and astronautics. It's listed in earth, space, and sciences, and it's listed here at the law school as well. And this year for myself, in cultural education that comes from teaching students who are coming from really fantastically different backgrounds. But what they all have in common is that they're all interested in trying to understand how we can use space to advance the interests or public interests of humanity around us, and not just above, in terms of going to Mars or the asteroids or even beyond. So the students are passionately concerned with how we can use space for social good in some ways. How do you advance the understanding based on that? And so we're at the very beginning stages of a very, very important phenomena that is going into place. And that is really small satellites, big data. I was telling Yoshi that I've just had a paper accepted in our flagship journal. It's called Small Satellites, Big Data, and it's really beginning to trace what the companies are doing, how that is having an impact on every social, political, environmental field that you can possibly imagine, and the fact that we don't have regulation, law, and policy to govern what happens to ordinary citizens around the world when that data is collected. Who collects it? Who keeps it? What does it actually do to our lives? And those are the questions that I think we really do need to ask from a legal and political standpoint. I always think that it's important to remember that technology is embedded in social and political realities. And in the end, it should serve human interests and bring us together and not divide us apart. It's very easy to do, as we have seen. And I think that is really sort of what galvanizes me and my colleagues on campus to try and address some of those things going forward. So as I say, we're inspired by the models that have been put by people like yourselves, Pam Samuelson, and I'm looking forward to working also with Bill in terms of the technology and public policy clinics to really advance not just the educational level, but also the experiential ability to train students. So that's what I'm interested in, passionate about.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I've been to several of the Spark events, virtually and in person. And what strikes me, of course, is the fact that there's people from all different disciplines. I mean, your co-founder is the chair of the aeronautics department, right? Is she not? Yeah. And I just, it's incredible that you can reach out to somebody in seemingly so disparate a field. Okay, well, I'm going to turn now to my longtime collaborator, Tadayoshi Kono. Yoshi, you and I worked together for quite some time. We co-founded the Tech Policy Lab together years ago. And I guess I want to ask you a bit, I do want to ask you about science fiction, which I'm going to do. I can't resist it every chance I get. But first I want to ask you, what led you to want to reach across campus? I mean, you and Ed Lazowska came to my offer dinner. Do you know what I mean? I mean, so what led you to want to reach across campus, and has it been as generative and rich as you hoped? And I won't take offense if you say no, but I just.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much for having me on the panel. And also want to just congratulations to all the people that are graduating. It sounds like L3s will be graduating soon. So congratulations on that. Yeah, Ryan, it is a great question. Why did I want to reach out across campus? It's almost, my answer is why would I not want to? In fact, I think Sadia and I are going to have some emails after this because
she'll bring you in. She'll draw you in.
We realize we have some intersecting areas of interest. But I guess everyone in this panel has so inspiring things to say, and I think I kind of echo a little bit of that. One was, Mary mentioned looking upstream, and I think that as scientists and as academics, my feeling is I want to address the problems that our society faces. And I don't necessarily, the way to address the problems that society faces isn't necessarily to say, what are the problems within my discipline that I can work on? It is, what are the problems that the world is facing today, or if we predict out into the future, what is the problems the world is going to face in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And what teams do we need? What types of perspectives do we need to address those problems? And the answer is almost always cross-disciplinary. So it is, and then, the facilities at the University of Washington really support those types of interactions. And so that's one thing. And then, Sadia, you mentioned, do what you love. And, to me, I love thinking about, for me personally, I love thinking at the cross-disciplinary space because I always realize I don't know enough. And I kind of was drawn to academia because I like learning. And, if I stay within my discipline, there's stuff that I know, but every time I interact with someone else, it's like, oh my gosh, I've become to accept the fact that I'll never know enough. And I'm working on a process whereby I can identify what I don't know and interact with people across campus so we can work on addressing important problems and relying on their expertise.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that, so your work and with your colleagues, of course, you understand also the conventions of many other disciplines, maybe most other disciplines, are much more cooperative sometimes than the conventions and norms around law. I think law is changing in that respect, but this is work with a team, sometimes even student-led. But I think about your work on computer security with respect to vehicles or embedded medical devices and the like. I wonder about the way in which your privacy and security lab has come to be an important partner for the Federal Trade Commission and for the Hill, Congress. And the people that are on faculty and even the students and postdocs are being tapped essentially to give expertise in these, for example, in multiple FTC workshops. Was that something you expected would occur, wanted to occur? Is it something you want to see more of?
It is a good question. It draws me back to a very long time ago. So basically, the little bit of context, which is why Professor Samuelson is so interesting to hear the history. In 2003, I was part of the team that did the very first security analysis of the software of electronic voting machine. This was the Diebold voting machine. This then connected me to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and Jason Schultz was one of the key people there that helped us. And this is 2003. So I was drawn in early, and basically what does that mean by drawn in? I was drawn into realizing that the research that we did within academia, when we're addressing important societal problems, are going to have the ability, not only the ability, but responsibility of informing decisions that are happening on the Hill and in companies, et cetera. And so I would say, I guess I've accepted it as the norm that if we're doing important work, then, hopefully people will listen. Maybe another thing that I will say, kind of have the mic, is that it is also really important to realize that the norms in different communities are different. And so my research area is computer security. Our operations are oftentimes around finding vulnerabilities and then fixing those vulnerabilities, which means that our norms involve critical analysis of other, technologies, et cetera, which I've realized is not the norm in other disciplines. And so one of the things we have to do is just figure out not only the shared language, but the shared norms of what is acceptable research and not, and so on.
Thank you so much. So I think I may not quite get to science fiction after all, but folks who are interested should come and talk to Yoshi. I promised I would come back to Pam, and then I'd like to open it up for a couple of your questions if you have them as well. And again, we do have a hard stop at 1:20 because there's a next class coming in here and people have to teach. So Pam, I wanted to just back out a bit after that and ask you in terms of some of the lessons that you've learned over the years working at the intersection of technology and society. In the sense of, are there things that have worked particularly well or not particularly well, right? What sorts of things do you think that this community could benefit from hearing as to your experience?
So I get dogged on some things, and when I get when I get really riled up, there's just no stopping. And so about a decade ago, there was a proposal to settle the Authors Guild versus Google case, the Google Books search case, and the proposal was to create a new digital library, and Google would get the permission to scan every book in the world, and it was willing to give $60 each to the authors of the or rights holders of the books, and it was going to give $30 million to start a new collecting society to kind of gather money for the subscriptions to the digital library, and then it was going to be able to like essentially own the digital library of all the world's stuff. And they wanted to do that through a class action settlement. And I just said, this is bullshit. Okay, this is really bullshit. And so one of the reasons why I was upset about it was because most of the books that were then in the Google Book Search library were academic books from the collections of various public universities, including University of Michigan and University of California. And for the most part, academics want our work to be more available. And so we don't like this kind of, you get to prioritize our books and the Authors Guild gets all the money. It's like, this doesn't make any sense to me at all. So I got on my high horse and I just said, you know, I'm probably not going to win this fight because so much money was, and so many, you know, if the publishers and the Authors Guild and Google are all in favor of it, it's like, this is hopeless, right? And I just persisted. I found kind of issues that I could raise that nobody else was raising from an author's perspective. And I persuaded the academic senate of the University of California to say they agreed that that this not taking public access into account was actually something that was really troubling. And so you just start marshaling things. So I'm basically, you know, I'm not a really good planner. I just kind of turn like a bull in a china shop and just do it until I kind of see if I can get something out of it. And so, so I appeared actually at the hearing about whether to certify this class settlement and whether it was fair and reasonable. I said, no, it's not fair and reasonable. And so I made my little presentation, and I mean, other people did too. I mean, the government, I was sandwiched between the government of Germany and government of France. So I wasn't there alone. But I was really proud of myself that when the judge finally issued his opinion, that one of the things that he said was that settlement was not fair to academic authors, that the Authors Guild had not adequately represented the interests of academic authors. And so, you know, this is just like, I made it up on the fly and I didn't know what I was doing, but I just sort of said, if I have a goal, I'm going to try to like think really broadly about sort of who else out there would be in an alliance, and then kind of coordinate with those people so that I could be a voice on this issue, because Amazon was against it for understandable reasons, and so is Microsoft for another set of reasons. They had their reasons and I was fine with them having their reasons, but I thought an author's wedge was actually something that would be important in something like this, because the Authors Guild was like, oh, we represent the interests of all authors. So I was, you know, that was a situation where I went into it thinking it was hopeless. And I just kind of like, for like 2 years, I did almost nothing but this in terms of my scholarship. But I felt like, you know, something worked.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that seems to me a very accurate personification of how the author guild talks. But anyway, yeah, no, I mean, I remember watching that, you know, with deep admiration, and as many of us did, sort of you on what looked like it was going to be a quixotic, you know, sort of
Me and my
Cervantes,
toothpick.
exactly, you and your toothpick and against tilting at windmills, and ended up being you know, a sort of a real lesson in the power of advocacy. So
And I can sort of add
yeah,
that,
yeah, please.
I did 2 other things in this case that I'm really, really proud of. One is that I submitted a brief that basically said the Authors Guild doesn't have standing to represent the interests of all authors. They can represent the interests of the books in which they own copyright. But in the HathiTrust case, they sought an injunction against all 7 million books that they were in the HathiTrust library that were in copyright. And the first line of my brief was that the Authors Guild owns 116 copyrights of books that are in this particular corpus, and yet they are seeking an order to essentially seize all 7 million. They don't have standing to do this. And the Second Circuit Court of Appeals came out and said they don't have standing. So that's one. 2 is that when they came down to the fair use issue, which as many of you know, the Court of Appeals did decide that Google had made fair use. I wrote another brief on behalf of the Authors Alliance, an organization of which I'm a co-founder. And I said, look, we are academic authors. We want people to find our books, okay? And the snippets that Google provides is actually really important to our ability to have our books. So we contacted people on our advisory board and said to them, you know, do you have books in the HathiTrust library or in the Google Books library that you would like to have people find? And so I had some quotes from some of our members. And again, I think that helped persuade the Second Circuit that Google had made fair use, because again, most of the books had been scanned from research library collections. So they weren't like, you know, all the popular fiction in the world. It was really our books, and most of which are out of print. And I just thought that, you know, again, this is me like being a little proud of myself, sorry.
I think people need to see folks being proud of their accomplishments, frankly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up for questions, either from maybe the panelists have questions, but maybe you do. I want to note that there is an opportunity to spend a little more time with Professor Samuelson in the Tech Policy Lab, which is 222, so it's upstairs. And she's going to join us for a little bit there, and you could talk to her as well. But I'm going to throw my mask on and come around with this microphone if anybody has a question. And I know we do have to have a hard stop again in 5 minutes, but does anybody have a question that they want to? Oh, you got a second. Okay. Would you mind? Then I can stay here. Anybody have a question? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jacob. This is a question for Professor Fan. You spoke about epidemiology. Are there any epidemiological principles that you've seen effectively applied to social trends such as patterns of violence you think policymakers and or lawyers should be aware of? Like, what have you learned that we should know about?
That's a great question, Jacob. And Jacob, I hope you can connect with the professors afterwards, because Jacob has some great ideas about policy work, like the inspiring work you've done. With respect to what we found, you know, so colleagues and we found that oftentimes a sentinel, and there's such sad things about patterns of violence. So for example, one of the first places that you can see a likely candidate for both a victim and a perpetrator of violence is in the emergency room. And so, and oftentimes an outreach spot, an early outreach spot, and the only outreach spot may well be before you enter the criminal justice system is in the emergency room for a gunshot wound, for example, if you want to disrupt future violence. So that's one finding that we did with data from Washington State. Colleagues and I, a wonderful, amazing scholar, Ali Rohani Rabar, who we're very lucky to have at the University of Washington, among others. Actually, students of here, my students actually have gotten interested in working with some of my colleagues too. So Melanie Cray, who just won an award voted by the student body, she actually worked with folks at Harborview on dating violence interventions and law and policy interventions in the dating violence prevention space. So that was really exciting. Another student of mine did some really interesting work on firearms seizures from people at risk to prevent and disrupt the escalation of domestic violence into fatalities and seizures and non-enforcement of seizures. There's just so much. I can go on forever, and I'm going to stop myself. I mean, I'll just say one more because there's so many things that are just so inspiring. Another person here at the University of Washington, and I've actually cited this sometimes in my teaching, is domestic violence protection orders. Like, do they really protect? And we actually found it's not, and people just say it's just a piece of paper. Well, I don't want to do all these hoops for a piece of paper. And so epidemiologists have found that that piece of paper is actually really important, that there is an association with the, in terms of the reduction of the risk of future violence if you get that piece of paper. And so anyways, there's so much more I can say. I'm sure I'm leaving stuff out, but that's just sampling.
Yeah, we can sneak maybe one more quick question in, and I know at least Sadia's got to run across campus to teach. And if you, any more questions there? Well, maybe I'll just, oh, you got one, excuse me. Sorry, Sal, yeah.
Hi, I'm Salt. I know in academia, sometimes it's long hours of toiling away and writing and doing research and thinking. What type of advice do you have to get that thinking into impact? Some of these public testimonies or things that you've gone to seem to have been very impactful and such, but is that really the path forward you suggest? This is, I guess, to any panelists.
So short answers, but this is a great question.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure,
Because I have
please,
to-
yeah.
I think that is a wonderful question that you're asking. You know, and I will begin by saying that generally in the social sciences, we are not so interested in sort of having an impact. We certainly consider the implications of what we're doing, but translating that into direct action or impact of some sort is not a priority, you know, in the social science. So something I would say that we are rewarded for in terms of our promotions, in terms of anything that might matter. And I think in terms of law and policy in the space field, though, I think it is significantly different because people can see, I'll just give you one example. We're all concerned about orbital debris. I don't know where you were last year, but we had, you know, rockets, boosters flying over the Pacific Northwest, and God forbid that that stuff might land on your heads, or on our houses, or in our yards, and so on and so forth. So some of the stuff that we're seeing happening in the space field has very direct consequences for human beings around us. And I think I'm very excited to sort of work with Ryan, as well as Bill and other people here at the law school at the intersection of that, of how we might be able to file briefs or raise awareness about it in public testimonies, but what is going on. This is not just an impact that affects the companies, but really human lives around us. So I think that is worthwhile. Maybe it's something small, but listening to Professor Samuelson, I'm so inspired because I think, look, you can make a small move and it may change the conversation. So I'm hoping that we will continue to do that in the interdisciplinary forums that we have here today.
So one thing that I will suggest is that if there are nonprofit organizations that that kind of resonate with you, very often they have either pro bono counsel opportunities, or they have committees that you can serve on, where when you have a particular interest, that you can then help the organization formulate some sort of thing. So in the case of that consumer union brief that I talked about with the garage door openers, Consumers Union, it kind of like focused on old fashioned technologies, right? They digital technologies like, ooh, like what's up with that? So it really took some work to persuade Consumers Union that software embedded in devices was something that was really going to be important, and that they shouldn't shun away from that, because there were these risks that everything would become essentially monopoly through kind of little digital protections that people would build into this. And I'm going to talk a little bit later today about John Deere. It turns out to be like a really bad actor when it comes to allowing farmers to repair their tractors. And they basically say, you don't own that tractor. You may have paid $50,000 for it, but you don't own it, because the software that drives it is ours. We own copyright in it, and we're technically protecting it, and you can't mess with our stuff without our permission. And so the right to repair is actually a nice example of something that kind of has bubbled up from the bottom. But if like the right to repair is your thing, there could be a bill before the Washington legislature. You could write to your congressperson, because there are several bills that are now pending in Congress. So, just look around for like, where are your interests? Who does those kind of things? How could you basically then help them make more of an impact?
All right, we have to end it there. Thank you for the great question and answers. Thanks, everybody. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Don't forget to clean up your stuff and come upstairs to talk to Pam Samuelson more. Thank you.